Good afternoon and welcome to another of our series on comparative religions. Today we're going to start by looking at a new group of religious communities. The last couple of months we've been looking at Judaism, all the various aspects of Christianity, and we've been looking most recently at Islam. But today we're going to start looking at another group of religious organizations that are still very active in our world. And they all share something very unique. They fall into a category called syncretism. Syncretism. And here's what we have. As soon as we get our thing, there it is, syncretism. This comes to us from the Greek language, from the word, two words, syn and kres, meaning a Cretan. An alliance of Cretans. It was an understanding from the ancient world that this was a group of people from the island of Crete that made alliances with other people, and they did this for a lot of different reasons. They joined forces. Sometimes they joined forces with another group of people in order to have some military strength or political strength, or just to gain some benefits from one another. What it means simply is a union of communities. And what you have is a different groups of people that would get together for some specific purpose. And what they would get out of that was a kind of a sense of mutual benefit. Also, they could combine together against a common enemy. So think in our world today, the formation of the NATO forces in Europe after World War II to oppose the forces of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. This combination of all of these different nations coming together to fight against or to be armed against a common enemy that they had. Very simple idea, and it was very popular in the ancient world and was very well used. But it also came to mean a fusion of diverse religious beliefs and practices, and that's what's going to impact us in our studies over the next couple of weeks here. Syncretism, taking a little bit of traditions from different religions, taking a little bit from here, a little bit from there, combining them together to form something new. And what we discover is many of what are called mystery religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Greek religious philosophical concepts have all been a part of this aspect of syncretism and working in our world. And we're going to see how that plays out. And we're going to start this by looking at a major religion of the world, one that has been around and probably is one of the oldest religions practiced in our world, that has added a lot to the religious traditions of everyone else. In a sense, they become almost the origins of much of the syncretism that we see in religious traditions in our world today. We go back to a very early religion known as Zoroastrianism. Now, Zoroastrianism is probably one of the world's oldest religions. From what we can gather from the historical record, they have been around for a very, very, very long time. It was founded by the prophet Zoroaster in ancient Iran approximately 3,500 years ago. It still continues to exist to this day. It is the smallest of the major religions in the world in the number of its adherents. It's a very small group of people, but its influence is much greater than the size of the Zoroastrianism of today. It is historically one of the most important religions of the world. The roots of this tradition are found in the Proto-Indo-European spirituality that also produced the great religions of India, Hinduism and Buddhism. This is something that has had a lasting impact in the world. It is the first of the world's religions to be founded by an inspired prophetic reformer. We have seen this, of course, in our study of Judaism and the formation of the whole patriarchal tradition beginning with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Inspired prophetic reformers, people like Moses. If we want to look at the Christian tradition, we would look at such people as Jesus of Nazareth, Peter, one of the disciples, the Apostle Paul, who gave the Christian church its largest amount of written understandings of the theology of Christianity. For Islam, we could look to Muhammad, the inspired prophetic reformer who begins this religious group. Zoroastrianism is started by this man, Zoroaster. He's also known as Zarathustra, and his name basically means the shining light. He lived in Persia, which is modern-day Iran, and lived there in the ancient world about 3,500 years ago. Actually, trying to find an exact date for him has been troublesome. Scholars place Zoroaster's birth somewhere between 1500 and 1200 before the Common Era. If we go back to the earlier time period in this frame of reference, to 1200 before the Common Era, we're looking at somebody who is coming on the scene prior to the arrival of Abraham. So it's a very ancient tradition in the world religions. In fact, scholars seem to indicate that Zoroastrianism has been the world's first monotheistic faith. And they take their traditions and carry them forward into the world, and this idea of monotheism catches on in many other places as the ideas of this religion begin to spread. Zoroastrianism was once the religion of the entire Persian Empire, which in the ancient world carried off a lot of territory. A huge amount of the Eastern world came under the influence of the Persian Empire over time. Today, the numbers of this religion who are still practicing are fewer than 200,000 people. They were influential in Mahayana Buddhism, and scholars believe they were especially influential in the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Again, this idea of going back and being the first religious group to actually develop and define a monotheistic faith, and being a religion that was started by a prophetic leader. These are traditions that we see carried on in the traditions of Judaism, of Christianity, and of course of Islam as well. Most religious historians believe the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim beliefs concerning God and Satan, the soul, heaven and hell, the virgin birth of a Savior, the slaughter of the innocents, resurrection, and final judgment were all things that were derived from Zoroastrianism. What we're going to see as we go forward is this kind of dualism that's at work in the beliefs of this tradition. We have God and Satan, we have heaven and hell, we have resurrection, we have final judgment. These ideas of this duality that go on in our world come to us out of the traditions of Zoroastrianism. And we'll see how that plays itself out as we continue on. Zoroastrianism passed on these concepts to the modern world. The cosmic struggle between right and wrong, central to their beliefs and practices. Monotheism, they are the ones who developed this concept according to religious scholars. They developed a hierarchy, a heavenly hierarchy of spiritual angels, archangels, all kinds of spiritual beings, and this was a big part of their tradition. They developed a concept of, final judgment. The understanding that some people in this life, when they die, are going to be rewarded with eternal rewards and glory, and others are going to be receiving eternal damnation because of the way they lived their life. This idea of judgment for the individual comes into play in the Zoroastrian tradition. They had a belief in the coming of a Messiah at the end of creation. And in many ways, that idea, that concept of a Messiah, has carried on in the traditions of Judaism, looking for the coming of a Messiah. It is carried on in the traditions of of Christianity that looked at Jesus as being the Messiah. And we understood from looking at the traditions of Islam, and particularly in the Shiite traditions of Islam, they are looking for the return of one of their great leaders, a Messiah who is going to come at the end of creation to put everything right. And they developed a concept of this understanding of an apocalypse, culminating in the final triumph of good over evil at the end of the historic cycle. Judaism had that tradition. If we look at the text of the Hebrew Scriptures, the book of Daniel is an apocalyptic writing about a struggle, a cosmic struggle between good and evil. If we look at the Christian tradition, the book of Revelation is an apocalyptic book. It's a book that talks about this struggle between good and evil that culminates in the end of the historical cycle that we now see. Of course, we have to understand, we have this concept of apocalypse as being this horrible, devastating, explosive warfare that's going to destroy everything in the world. But the word apocalypse in the Greek, which we take that word from, basically means a revelation, a revealing of the will of God. And so we have to understand these texts very carefully. But the concept of this major struggle, this final struggle between good and evil, and the triumph of good, comes to us out of the traditions of Zoroastrianism. So let's take a look at the history of where they are, where they come from, how they have had prominence in our world. And what we know is that Zoroastrianism has flourished during three great periods of time when the Persian empires were very strong. The first was the Achaemenid Empire, which was founded by Cyrus the Great. Basically, Cyrus lived between the years of 585 and 529 before the Common Era. Cyrus the Great was the one who really created the beginning of the Persian rule in the world. He established an empire that extended from Asia Minor in the west to India in the east, and from Armenia in the north to Egypt in the south. This is a huge empire with a phenomenal influence in the world. Cyrus was able to go out and conquer other nations. When he conquered those other nations, well, basically in a way he practiced a lot of syncretism himself by taking what was good from those cultures and incorporating them into his own systems. It worked very well for him. One of the things, though, that Cyrus did was he showed great compassion, great concern, and great respect for any country, any nation that he had conquered. He valued their traditions, he valued their beliefs and their religions, and found them all to be perfectly acceptable. He allowed his conquered people to govern themselves and to allow them to follow their own religious traditions, their own religious beliefs. He wasn't forcing anything on anyone. He was, and the Persian Empire was, of course, the ultimate rule and authority, but by allowing people to have self-government, to allow people to continue on in their own religious traditions, is a good way to have a stable society. One of the nations that Cyrus was able to conquer quite easily was the Babylonians. The Babylonians, of course, had a different look on the world. When they conquered their enemies, they would strip their enemies of their land, take the people captive, put them in another place so they're away from their homeland, and basically try to destroy all of their culture and destroy their religion. We know this from the Babylonian exile of the Jewish people, beginning with the fall of the temple in 587, before the Common Era, and the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, and the people being carried away in exile to Babylon. When Cyrus invaded Babylon, he set the Jewish people free, allowing them to return back to Judea, their own country. Not only that, but in the process of allowing them to return, Cyrus even provided the Jewish people returning to the land of Judea with the resources they needed to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Wonderful thing that took place, and he became a very prominent and well-known person. In fact, there's something very fascinating about Cyrus of Persia. In the Hebrew text of the book of Isaiah in chapter 45, Cyrus is mentioned as a savior, and he is the only person in the Hebrew scriptures who is called the Mashiach, the Messiah, the Anointed One. That is the name that is given in the Hebrew scriptures to Cyrus and Cyrus alone. Fascinating. Here's a little bit of an aside. The Achaemenians had constant conflict with the Greeks in the western end of their empire. They were constantly fighting against the Greek Empire, who was going to be the prominent power in the world at that time. Darius the Mede, who was a successor of Cyrus, sent a large force of his army to go to the city of Athens to capture it and to finally put Greece under the control of the Persian Empire. The Greeks had heard of the plan, and what they did was they sent one of their soldiers, a guy who was very good at running, to head off to Athens to warn the citizens that they were about to be attacked. The interesting aspect, historical aside, was the place where this occurred was the city of Marathon. And from Marathon to Athens was 26 miles. And their runner had to run from that one town to the main city, from Marathon to Athens, and therein lies the history and the origins of our marathon races in our world today. 26 miles is exactly what the distance was, and we still continue to keep that as a historical marker in the back of our minds. A little bit more of the history of the Zoroastrians. The Achaemenid Empire came to a close with the rise of Alexander. Alexander, in 334, conquered all of Persia. He plundered the treasury, and he burned all of the libraries of the main principal city of Persepolis. Many of the priests of Zoroastrianism were killed. They were the ones who were considered to be the living libraries of the religion because they had committed to memory all of the sacred writings of this religious faith. And they were all put to death, and so a lot of their traditions were lost to time. Somewhere around the year 250 before the Common Era, a Parthian tribe from northeastern part of Iran overthrew the Greeks and established a second Persian empire that was just as extensive as the empire under Cyrus the Great. Again, taking up most of the ancient Near East. The Parthians were also Zoroastrians, and they also were very tolerant of the religious beliefs of any lands that they conquered. They were very nice towards people that they took over and allowed them to continue their own practices while they held to their Zoroastrian beliefs themselves. The Parthian Empire found themselves, however, fighting constant battles and constant wars with the next great power group that was coming up, the Roman Empire. And the fighting between the two of them continued on for quite some time. Yet the Romans were never able to overcome the Parthians, and for sure, the Romans never ever adapted any of the Zoroastrian beliefs. During the 500-year reign of the Parthians, the religion was quite unregulated, and differing forms of Zoroastrian began to develop in this time period because many of the leading priests were killed and the knowledge that they had was all in their minds. A lot of their beliefs and practices were destroyed, and of course now they're beginning to see different forms of the religion starting to form and develop. as we move into later on in history, in the year 225 in the Common Era, a group known as the Sasanians rose up against the Parthians and overthrew them to create what became known as the Third Persian Empire. The Sasanians wanted to unify Zoroastrianism and to establish rules about the faith. And what they were doing was trying to say, this is who we are, and this is what we believe. And they were actually involved in a lot of proselytizing, because at this very same time, the Christian community moving into the Persian Empire were beginning to proselytize in the sake of Christianity. So Zoroastrianism is beginning to be much more structured, much more formalized, and it becomes the official state religion of the Persian Empire somewhere around the year 225 in our Common Era. They were able to hold on to that for quite some time until the year 641, when the Arabs invaded Persia and Islam became established as the religious group in the world. This new regime, under the Arab influence, gave the local population of Persians and Zoroastrians these choices. You can convert to Islam. You can pay a heavy tax, which the Islamic tradition imposes upon non-believers, or we'll kill you. It's your choice, whatever you want to do. This began to put a severe pressure upon the Zoroastrians, and it led to a lot of disruption throughout the entire Persian Empire, which is now coming under the total influence of Islam. The Arabs mistreated the Zoroastrians in many ways and made life very difficult for those who chose not to convert. Punishment of death, all kinds of horrible taxes were against them. They were stripped of all possible means of support. It was a horrible situation. And what happens after a couple of hundred years of enduring this? A group of Zoroastrians from the Khorasan province of Iran made their way to the port of Hormuz on the Persian Gulf, and they set sail for India. They eventually settled on the western coast of India in the Gujarat region, and the community there is still connected to Zoroastrianism to this very day. It was one of the ways that they were able to continue to survive and thrive once they left the influence of the Islamic tradition in now what is becoming no longer the Persian Empire, which is now a part of the Islamic Empire at this time period. The Zoroastrians left behind in Iran continued to suffer under very adverse conditions. However, that community is still there to this day. It's still active in Iran. It has an unusually high number of very successful people, and they continue to actually thrive while living in Iran, which we know is an Islamic republic at this point in time. Within the past few decades, there has been an immigration of Zoroastrians from Iran and from India coming into the Western world. And now you will find these traditions in Europe. You will also find them here in the United States. Now, some of the beliefs and some of the ways in which the Zoroastrians have understood the world and their cosmology. The cosmology of this tradition, the head of the manifested universe, is Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord. This is their understanding of the way the world has been created and how the world is governed. He is the universal and pervasive source and the fountain of all life. Everything that exists comes because of Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord. He is the creator and the sustainer of all life. And from Ahura Mazda comes this duality, which becomes so prevalent in the traditions of Zoroastrianism and have found their way into the traditions of, as I said earlier, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There's a belief in this system that there are two spirits in this world: the holy or bountiful spirit and the destructive or opposing spirit. And these two spirits are prominent and active and working in the world. They are popularly thought of as good and evil. And these are the two principles that represent, in the Zoroastrian tradition, of the opposites of life. There is always these opposite extremes that are at work in the world. Emanating from Ahura Mazda, the divine creator, these are the expressions of divine reality. The good mind, in other words, divine wisdom and divine love. The highest truth, righteousness, a way of living your life to be connected to this reality of the divine. A desirable dominion, which is heaven. We seek to find that in our lives, and we seek to have that as the goal that we attain. A person is to have holy or bountiful devotion, the expression of piety, being a very pious person and living life in that way. Looking for wholeness and spiritual integrity. And of course, the ultimate reality is, well, immortality is what we seek to achieve in the process of living life. These are the expressions of divine reality, and these are the goals, the absolute objects of worship and practice and piety in the Zoroastrian tradition. Try to say that word 10 times. I keep tripping up over it as I go on. Zoroastrianism worldviews. The world has been created by Ahura Mazda, and it is meant to evolve to perfection according to the divine order of things. So if we go back and take a look at the good mind, the highest truth, the desirable dominion, the holy or bountiful devotion, wholeness, immortality, these are the things that the world is meant to evolve into. This perfection of the way the divine has wanted the world to be ordered. This is what Ahura Mazda had in mind in the creation of the world. Duality exists as part of the manifestation. And so, the understanding is that human beings always have free will to choose between these dual opposites. You have the choice before you all day long, every day. Do you choose what is good? Do you choose what is evil? Do you choose what is whole and balanced? Do you choose that which is not? This is your choice because you have the expression of free will. And since you have the power of choice, you also have the personal responsibility for choosing the best way, choosing for good, choosing for wholeness, choosing for piety. These are the things that we should strive toward because we have the power of choice. And in the Zoroastrian tradition, personal salvation is attained by making the right choice. Every day, all day long, every day, you have this choice before you to do good or to do bad, to do what is right, to do what is wrong. Personal salvation is attained by making the right choice all the time, which requires a very good understanding of the world. The salvation of the world is the restoration of the world to its perfect state, one that is in complete accord with Hashem. It is the understanding that the only way that we can have salvation ourselves and the only way the world can ever be restored is for us to live our lives in complete accord with the teachings of Ahura Mazda. As human beings make the right choices, they are furthering the realization of salvation, not just for themselves, but for the entire world. And our goal should be to help the process of restoration of the world to its perfect state. So, some of the practices of Zoroastrianism concern the reality of death. According to the tradition, after the death of the body, the soul remains in this world for 3 days and 3 nights in the care of one angel. That didn't type out the way it was supposed to. During this period, the family members, the survivors of the person who died, prayers are being said and rituals are performed in order to assure the safe passage of the soul into the spiritual realm. On the 4th day, the spirit is believed to have crossed over to this other world. So what happens here is this understanding is that the body dies. This flesh and blood we carry around with us all of the time dies. But it is the soul that continues to live on and crosses over into this spiritual realm, this new world. This is immortality in a new way. The soul then meets a maiden who is the embodiment of all the good words, all the thoughts and deeds of its preceding life. And you are confronted with all of those good things that you have done. If the soul has led a righteous life, the maiden appears as a beautiful figure. On the other hand, if you did not lead a righteous life, this maiden who appears is going to appear as an ugly hag. And you will know right away whether you have been, rewarded with eternal blessing or with eternal punishment. This is the thing that they look forward to. This image, whether it's foul or fair, confronts the soul, and the soul acknowledges that the image is in fact an embodiment of its own actions. And therefore, it is the soul that judges itself. We know whether we are worthy to cross over to the other side or if we must return to earth to learn further lessons. Our actions throughout life are exposed to us. We see them all in their totality, and we will know if we have been good or if we have been evil. We will know if we have done what is right or we have done what is wrong, and whether or not we are able and worthy to cross over to the other side. Zoroastrianism places a great emphasis on purity and not defiling any of the elements of Ahura Mazda's creation. Purity, proper living, right living, and care for the world and everything in it is a part of the emphasis of this faith tradition. For that reason, traditionally in Zoroastrianism, they do not bury bodies and they do not cremate bodies. These things were not practiced. Instead, they have a place where the bodies were taken. It was called a Tower of Silence. The body was laid out there under the sun where the body would naturally decompose and vultures would devour the body. This is a very strange and unusual tradition in the world. Throughout most of human history, one of the aspects that all human beings around the globe have practiced has been the practice of intentional burials of people when they have died. Some of the oldest archaeological aspects that we have discovered in our world will show that as far back as 300,000 years ago, our human ancestors were already practicing the rites of burial when someone died. Cremation was something that was practiced from time to time, but leaving a body out to be naturally decomposing is a rarity in the history of cultures and particularly in the history of religious groups. And yet Zoroastrianism practices this type of disposal of the body by leaving it out there to basically decay and where it can be devoured by vultures or other animals. Fire is a major symbol in Zoroastrianism, and it has a central role in the most important religious ceremonies. It has a special significance, being the supreme symbol of God and the symbol of divine life. Fire, right at the center of everything in the existence of the cosmology of the Zoroastrian tradition. Fire, sun, stars, and light are all regarded as the visible tokens of the divine and of the inner light. Again, sharing a tradition that we see in other places in religion, the human being has this divine presence, this divine spark, this inner light inside the body, as it is described, that are marks and the visible signs of the divine. We have that understanding in aspects of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as well as other religions as well. That inner light is the divine spark that burns within each of us. There is something about God that is inside of us. What do we call it? Do we call it the divine spark, like the Zoroastrians? Do we call it the image of God? Remember the story in the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 1, God creates the human beings and breathes the breath of life into them, and they are made in the image of God. Divine presence in the divine breath. There's some way of explaining the fact that within us as human beings, there's this reality of God already inside of us. Zoroastrian practices were very much focused on that. Zoroastrian places of worship are called fire temples. In them, an eternal flame is kept burning with sandalwood and frankincense. The first fire to be lit upon an altar is said to have been brought down from heaven by Zoroaster himself. Today, the Zoroastrians do not proselytize, and consequently, to become a member, you have to be born into the faith. They do not try to reach out and convert anyone. If a Parsi woman marries outside of the religion, her children cannot be Zoroastrians. Parsi is the word for the people of the Persian Empire, as it would have been known. It is that entire region that we now know today as Iran. It is the name of their people, and the language is Farsi. If a woman who is a part of the Zoroastrian tradition marries outside the religion, her children cannot be a part of the faith. However, if a man marries outside of the religion, his children can become Zoroastrians, but his wife cannot. She cannot convert, but their children can become Zoroastrians. And here we go. The basic moral principles that guide the life of this community are good thoughts, the intention or moral resolution to abide by Asha, the right order of things. Your good thoughts have to govern every action that you do in your life. They keep an eye on everything that you do, and they guide you and direct you in what you have to do. Good words. The words that you speak, the language that you use, the way you interact with other people have to be according to the good thoughts and a communication of that intention to live by this moral principle. Good deeds. It's not enough to think right thoughts. It's not enough to have good words, words of righteousness, words of truth. But that has to be put into action. Good deeds is a realization that action is carrying out what is in your heart, what is in your mind, what is in your language. Living those things is what becomes most important. Now, Zoroastrianism has its roots in the ancient world. It is possibly the oldest monotheistic religion known in our world today. A lot of these beliefs that shaped and fashioned the way Zoroastrianism has survived throughout the world are the very things that have been picked up by and utilized by other religions, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or some of the other religious traditions that we're going to be looking at in the coming weeks. So we're going to finish there for today. Next Friday when we pick up, we'll be back again looking at some more of these syncretistic religious traditions. I hope you enjoyed today's program and look forward to seeing you again next week. Have a wonderful afternoon.